Entropy can be discussed in terms of disorder, right? But it also can be discussed in terms of randomness, right? Or in terms of the distribution of microstates, as it is called, right? In the thermodynamics perspective, right? So when we have randomness inherently requires some element of unpredictability. When we look at the Indian knowledge systems, we have this element of Daiva, right? Which is the divine will. It is not predictable. It is often even opaque to those who are not seekers or who don't believe in it, basically. And that leads to a lot of confusion as to why we are doing things in the way we are. In contrast, while the heat aspect is looked at purely from a statistical aspect or a thermodynamic aspect in modern physics, heat and Agni, especially the element of Agni, is looked at from a more ontological perspective in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara. There is a connection of the heat, the thermodynamics, with the information side of things. Right? Now, it's very interesting because in Advaita Vedanta, we speak about heat and energy, right, as something which is immanent. But underlying it is a more fundamental level of consciousness. In Yajna, I mean, let's first start with the Agni as it is. When we put the Ahuti, when we put the oblations into the Agni, the idea is that that oblation is being transformed, right, into something which is being offered more directly into the spiritual realm. So it is a material thing transforming to something spiritual. So the mediator of that is basically Agni. Right? In the Rig Veda, that's why we start with the devotion to Agni. Right? The first shlok itself, the first kind of very starting of Rig Veda has to do with Agni.
Namaste viewers, welcome to Sangam Talks once again. We had started this series on physics, and not only physics through the lens of Indian knowledge system, that is IKS. So we have with us Dr. Mrittunjoy Guha Majumdar. Namaste, Dr. Guha Majumdar. Well, in the first episode, we explored the intriguing connection between the Indian knowledge systems and advanced physics. Dr. Guha Majumdar guided us through the fundamental principles of quantum physics, shedding light on the nature of reality and its deep interconnection across space and time. He illustrated how IKS offers profound insights, particularly through concepts like the unity of Atman and Brahman, drawing the meaningful analogies. However, the evolution of physics wasn't a sudden leap in the modern understanding of the universe. It unfolds a gradual step-by-step process. In this episode, we will delve into the fascinating subject of particle dynamics and the underlying order they follow. Our focus will shift to thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, exploring how these principles shape our understanding of the natural world. So, welcome, Dr. Guha Majumdar ji.
Thank you so much.
First question, the nature of particle and energy interaction has been a central theme in both modern physics and ancient Indian thoughts. How do the Vaisheshika concepts of Dravya and Guna compare with the contemporary understanding of particle interactions, especially in the context of heat transfer, energy conservation, and the statistical behavior of particle?
Right, Devashish, thank you for the kind introduction. This is a very important area of research and of understanding the nature of reality, which is what we are trying to do in this interaction. Vaisheshik Darshan, which was formulated primarily by Acharya Kannad, gives an ontological framework that encompasses 6 different kinds of categories or padarth and looks at 3 major elements, right? The dravya, the gun, and the karma. Right? Dravya being the substance, guna being the characteristic, you can call it, right? And karma relating to the action side of things. Now, Acharya Kannad told us about the way in which different atoms or different fundamental elements of nature conjoin and come together, right? So they have different patterns that, they use. I mean, so there are, for instance, dyads being 2 different atoms coming together. There are triads, tetrads, and so on and so forth. Acharya Prashastapad, he was more towards the dyadic side of things. He spoke about how dyads come to be, how 2 different atoms can come together. And in one of his very seminal texts, which is the Padartha Dharma Sangraha, in the text 84 of Padartha Dharma Sangraha, Acharya Prashastapad tells us about how when heat is applied, to different kinds of objects, primarily to do with, let's say, jars made of clay or certain other substances, how the various movements that happen, right, in the material itself because of the application of heat, how that kind of brings about significant changes in characteristics. So for instance, the color aspect of that jar has been spoken of in the text 84 of the Padartha Dharma Sangraha, and he speaks about how the idea of disjunction happens, right, which means how the composition of the jar, right, which is a conjunction of different atoms, different elements, that kind of gives way to a disjunction of sorts, right? So this is a very important aspect, so to say. In Vaisheshik Darshan, there are both of these ideas of samyoga and vibhaga, right, which means conjunction and disjunction. And there are certain aspects of these samskaras, right, which is these tendencies that are out there, right? So you have basically vega, which is basically velocity. You can talk about velocity with respect to that. Bhavana, which is basically disposition, and stitistapak, which is basically your idea of elasticity, right? How the elasticity aspects comes into the picture. Now, besides these tendencies, we also have the influence of adrishta, which is basically this idea of this unseen force that applies its influence on all the various phenomenological or physical objects and elements, so to say. In modern physics, we know that the way particles interact is usually with respect to the fundamental forces of nature, right? So there are 4 different fundamental forces as we know it. There is electromagnetism, there is strong force, there is weak force, and then there is gravity, right? Now, gravity, interestingly, has a mention in the Vaisheshik Darshan, so to say. So when we talk about gravity, Acharya Anam Bhatt, he talks about it as the first non-inherent cause of falling, right? Of something which is falling from, let's say, some height, so to say. And the term that is used is Gurutva, right? We all have heard about Gurutva Karshan, right? So Gurutva is spoken about. And there is a sutra, a shlok from the Vaisheshik Sutra, which says, Sanyoga Bhave Gurutva Patanam. Right? Sanyoga bhave gurutva patanam, right? Which means that without the element of conjunction, in the absence of conjunction, that which causes something to fall, patanam is that which, makes something fall, is gurutva. Right, is the element of gravity, if you will. But I mean, gravity is something we have interpolated now, right? But back in the day, it could have encompassed something more than that, but it definitely encompasses this element of an object falling, so to say, right? Now, heat transfer in physics, right? There are 3 different modes in which it usually happens, right? So one is radiation, then there is conduction, and there is convection, right? So radiation, we have seen that there are many different ways in which light and heat is spoken about in Vaisheshik Sutra and also in different other Indian knowledge systems. But what is very interesting is in the idea of conduction, right? So when conduction is spoken about, we see that Nyaya, right, says that there are certain heat corpuscles, right, heat particles almost, right, and they kind of move into the different, the structure of the object itself, right, but they don't lead to the disintegration or the disjunction, so to say, right. So this idea is called the doctrine of Pitarapak, right, which is basically this idea that there's no disjunction per se. Now, Vaisheshik has a slightly variant kind of purview on this, a slightly different perspective, where it does talk about the disjunction of the composition, so to say, and the effect of the heat corpuscles or the heat itself on the different constituents of a certain composition, let's say, right? So in that sense, it's called, there's a different doctrine altogether, which is spoken of as Pilupaka, right? So Pitharapaka and Pilupak, which is basically the Nyaya and the Vaisheshik aspect of heat transfer, so to say. Now, convection is not explicitly mentioned, but obviously convection, because tejas, right, this idea of heat or the idea of, you wouldn't call it radiation per se, but heat is the best kind of you speak about. Teja, right, we talk about teja. So that itself has an effect on different kinds of elements in nature, right, and different physical objects, so to say, and that leads to motion as well. Right? Now, whether that is graded motion, right? Convection talks about how the hot air goes up and the cold air comes down, right? Is something which has not been mentioned in those terms necessarily, but in other ways it has been presented in some of the works, so to say. So we see that in the Indian knowledge systems and in Vaisheshik Darshan, there have been a lot of different nuances of heat, of energy transfer, of energy distribution, how heat makes an impact on any physical object, so to say, which is quite advanced, so to say, right? I mean, because if we look at it from the physical perspective today,
it seems like
right,
that they understood
the various aspects.
Temperature and heat.
Absolutely, right? And in fact, I would say they went one step further. They also looked at it from the microscopic perspective, right? They looked at it, this idea, the heat corpuscles, right? It talks about this thing that where is this agitation in the system coming from, right? Why is that coming about, right? That comes because of the interaction of the heat corpuscles with the elements in the body, right?
The fundamentals
of thermodynamics, right? Kinetic theory, statistical mechanics, right? So that is a beautiful kind of perspective, so to say, which I really appreciated studying about in my own time and, writing about as well. So that gives you a really good idea that, the Indian knowledge systems had quite an advanced understanding of that. Yeah.
We are now coming to know about many things about the Indian knowledge system. So you used the term samskara.
Yeah.
So maybe it's time to change the term dharma from samskara in order to express the properties of matter.
Right. So there are actually, if you look at samskaras, I mean, in the human context, we talk about samskaras in a certain way, but samskaras are actually about tendencies, right? I mean, it's often talked about as latent tendencies, right? So there's this talk of karmic samskaras, right? Which is seeded in your karmic journey, so to say, and how do you kind of work around with that, right? So it need not necessarily be the sanskar that we talk about. It is much more universal and broader in its understanding, I mean, in the way we can present it, than what we usually do.
It's the property.
Yes, tendencies or properties. Mention about. Yeah.
So my next question will be, how do perspective from Indian knowledge system relate to modern atomic theory?
Right.
And the kinetic theory of gases and the thermodynamic principles governing phase transition.
So in this, Acharya Kannad is obviously, his Paramanu theory, which we had already discussed about, is important, but also Acharya Nagarjuna, right, when he spoke about the Rasa Shastra, when he talked about metallurgy and the chemical transformations and so on, there are many aspects of modern theory which kind of we see some resonances with. So for instance, in Vaisheshik Darshan, we talk about the Dvinuka, right? The Dvinuka is the two, basically. That's the first point of conjunction of two different atoms, let's say, right? Two atoms coming together. And these elements, right? These elements are always in constant motion, right? They are always moving around. And this again reminds us of statistical theory, where we talk about the constant movement, so to say. Now, when we talk about the periodic table, right, there is an element of classification that is dependent on the atomic number, for instance, and many different, if you look at the history of how it happened, right, right from Mendeleev's time, and even before that, how the atomic mass came to be the basis, and so on and so forth, right? But in the Indian knowledge systems, in Nyaya Vaisheshik, there are different kinds of atoms, so to say. In fact, the elements which are out there, which Prithvi, Jal, Vayu, and so on and so forth, they each have been annotated or given a certain kind of form of an atom, essentially.
But element of understood, an atom, yeah. I mean, by Anuka, what you use the term, so they categorically understood that Anuka means atoms, right?
We have to be a little careful in the way we define Anukas itself, because the way they were describing it is in terms of indivisible, eternal elements, essentially, right? Now, we know today that the idea of the atom itself is composed of subatomic particles, and those themselves are composed of further, constituents and so on and so forth. So to exactly equate it would not be the best thing to do, but there is definitely a resonance of sorts about how the different kinds of atoms were discussed about. And in this case, the atoms were discussed about based on the elements, right? The Pancha Mahabhut and the various other aspects of that. Whereas if you look at the Jain philosophy, they talk about the homogeneous matter composing all the different forms of physical entities that we see out there, right? So they don't have this variation that we see about as such, right? Now, when we talk about this motion of the particles, right? The motion of the particles has to do with the samskaras, definitely, but it also primarily actually has to do with this idea of adrishta, right? Adrishta is this unseen force as such, which is leading to the different kinds of things we see around in nature as such, right? In fact, they go so far as to say that all of matter that we see, right, are premised on a pre-existing kind of framework, you could call it, or a certain premise, so to say. And that was in fact even used later in the 11th century by Udayanacharya to talk about the existence of God. Right? Even the existence of God was how these atomic excitations or movements happen, right? What is the underlying kind of causative element that is making that happen, right? So Udayanacharya mentioned about that as a potential way to discuss about God or divinity, so to say.
Potential way to express bosons.
Motions, right? But
Bosons.
Bosons, right?
Bosons.
Well, bosons, yes, you could say, I mean, if they're force mediating particles, right, so to say. But he was, I think, talking about a much more broader kind of framework where even fermions or, you know, even other kinds of particles, what are the agitations and why they are spontaneously doing what they are. There is this element of adrishta which was there, and that was used as a potential, link towards the idea of God, essentially, right? And then we see that in Buddhism, right, Vasubandhu, right, he had mentioned about atomism in his Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya, right, but later on he kind of, gave a criticism of sorts, right, in the Vimshatika Vignapti Matrata Siddhi, right, which is one of his seminal texts as well. So we see this constant kind of tussle between atomism and that which is beyond, and across the different schools of thought, right? Now, when we talk about the phases of matter, right, we know that in our current understanding in physics, right, we have actually 5 different phases of matter. We have the solids, the liquids, gases. We also have plasma. And then we now have Bose-Einstein condensate as well, right? So there are 5 as we know it. There could potentially be more as well. Now, in Nyaya Vaisheshik, the way we again do acknowledge that there are these states of matter, not quite in the form of, we don't have a plasma, let's say, or a BEC in that way, but the way to go between from one to the other, right, in terms of heating and cooling and so on and so forth. So there is aspect of tapan, for instance, which is the idea of how you kind of lead to the heating of the elements, right? And then you have Sthiti Karana, which is basically your cooling aspect, right? Interestingly, you also have a very big role of sublimation, right, which comes into the picture. And in Rasa Shastra, for instance, in modern physics, we have it in iodine, in dry ice, in mercury, and so on and so forth. In Rasa Shastra, you talk about it in terms of Urdhva Patana, right, which is basically this idea of sublimation, right? It's also found in Rasa Ratnakara by Acharya Nagarjuna as well. Right. One of the examples that is often given is that of Nada Yantra. Right. This is a method whereby cinnabar is a form of mercury. Right. Mercury, actually, I think it's you can talk about it in terms of the sulfide of mercury, and it was called as hingula. Right. So when hingula is wrapped in cotton cloth, right, and it is ignited, right, then you basically get a certain kind of material from that, right, and that is what the material you get basically is called as parada, which is mercury, essentially, right, and that is a sublimate. It's collected as a sublimate, right. So sublimation was used to attain a lot of efficacy, right, and purity in the metallurgical processes in different kinds of chemical transformation, so to say, and particularly also in the case of bhasma. Right, bhasma, which is, we all are familiar with the idea of bhasma, calcined powder of sorts, right? So we see that there was a big role of sublimation, right, which came to be in our Indian knowledge systems, particularly from this school of thought, essentially. And in the Rasendra Chudamani, right, which is a text on Rasa Shastra, we also see discussions on marana, which is basically calcination and purification of certain kinds of substances as well, right? So you see, there was a very advanced understanding again of the different forms of matter, of substances, and how we go from one to the other with respect to heating, with respect to cooling, and also the sublimation, right, which takes it directly from, let's say, it bypasses in certain ways one of the states of matter, so to say, right? Now, one aspect that comes to mind always, which is an allegorical or a metaphorical aspect, and which is a beautiful aspect, right? Which is acknowledged even by CERN, for that matter, is the Tandava Nritya of Shivji,
Yes.
right? So, when you think about the dance of particles, of entities, right? I don't think there is a more kind of universally accepted or a universally celebrated, representation than the Tandava Nritya. And in the Tandava Nritya, if you see, I like to see a little more than often what is discussed. So, for instance, the uplifted leg of Shivji, right? It could we can think about it as high energy states of sorts, right? We could think about the feet which is down as the low energy states, and the whole distribution of states that are there with the mudras and the lay, how it goes about. And when we talk about physics and statistical mechanics, we talk about the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution, right? Where you have different range or spectrum of velocities of particles. So we see, and we all celebrate the different mudras, the different stages of the Tandava. In fact, the Lasya Tandav and the Rudra Tandav, right, the gentle form and the fierce form, so to say, also talks about how the matter is kind of oriented when it is, a little more condensed, when it is more active, right? But the most beautiful part in this is that this is not just a chaotic kind of movement of particles, right? I mean, Shivji also, when he does the Tandav Nritya, right, it is not just about destruction, right? It is intricately tied to a renewal. It is intricately tied to a rebirth of sorts as well, right? And so even in physics and statistical mechanics, one of the most beautiful ideas that I always kind of, like to discuss is the idea of order out of disorder, right? Of organization out of disarray or randomization, so to say, right? And I think we see that, chaotic systems also can self-regulate, right? Or get attracted towards certain moments of stability or cohesion, basically, right? So that is a beautiful kind of concept that I myself like to see in the Tandava Nritya, right? And I feel is a very important kind of aspect of that, essentially.
Maybe the tongue of fire represent the weak.
Right. So the fire, I mean, itself is a very important element of that nritya, right? And it is that again ties into our discussion of statistical mechanics and thermodynamics, so to say, because fire, heat, right, the aspect of energy, right, is intricately linked to how that dance is taking place, right, and how the flux of energy is happening, right? Yes. So that is a beautiful thought and a motive that we have. Right. Yes, definitely.
That's fascinating. I mean, how they considering the modern scientific tools we are using today, and they potentially find out these physical properties back then, these sages, so to say.
Right.
So when it comes to the irreversibility of objects, let's talk about entropy, sir.
Right.
So entropy, as formulated in statistical mechanics, describes the measure of disorder.
Right.
We know that. And irreversibility in a system. So can insights from IKS offer a deeper understanding of entropy, thermodynamical irreversibility, and the emergence of complexity in the universe?
Right. So for this, I would like to kind of shift slightly from Vaisheshik to Sankhya for a bit. In Sankhya, as well as in Vedanta for that matter, there is a certain way in which the stages of the creation of nature, right, of the different elements of nature comes about, right? So for instance, in Sankhya, you have the Purusha Prakriti, right? And that leads to different elements like Mahat, for instance, the great principle, so to say, and then so on and so forth. We go forward from there. We get to the subtle elements, the Tanmatras, and then to the grosser elements, the Panchamahabhut and the things that arise from that. Now, we see that there is a gradual movement from a kind of more unified, more symmetric, more ordered state to one that has more complexity, more disorder of sorts, right? Now, one story or anecdote which I really kind of think relates to this, right? About how disorder or how the irreversibility of movements happen, is also with Ma Ganga's, descent to the earth,
Okay.
right? So when, we have in the Bhagavad Puran, this is mentioned in the Mahabharata, Ramayana as well. There was a point where there was a plea to Ma Ganga, right, to kind of descend from the heavens towards the earth, and she did. But because of her ferocity, because of her the power of her flow, essentially, it led to a lot of destruction, essentially, right? Then Shivji, right? I mean, he kind of took her into the matted hair, right, of sorts, and then stopped or punctuated the flow and the ferocity of the flow, essentially, of Ma Ganga. Now, the thing is that kind of makes us think about dissipative structures, right? How that kind of leads to different elements of the energy flow, right? And the dissipation of energy, so to say, and a channelized way of doing so, right? However, what it also shows about is that Ma Ganga, once she had started flowing, right? There was a flow which we still, Bharatvarsh is indebted, is endowed with this blessing, which we call as Ma Ganga, right? Which has, had our civilization almost thrive around it over millennia, essentially. And so once she started flowing, right, there wasn't a return of sorts to the celestial realm, so to say, right, which also kind of represents the way in which energy, or all that we see in thermodynamics, right, there's a certain element of reversibility and irreversibility, right, that is very, very intrinsic to the aspect of thermodynamics itself. And in this case, we see that there is an inherent irreversibility which is present in Ma Ganga's flow, so to say, right? So when we talk about Indian knowledge systems and entropy, there are a few aspects of Buddhist thought, of course, right, where we talk about anitya, right, this idea of impermanence, right? But also we talk about this element of pralaya, right? Pralaya, which is there in Hindu eschatology, right? Where there are different types of pralaya, right? So we have, for instance, Brahma pralaya, right? Which talks about when a kalpa, right, it kind of ends, right? The cosmic dissolution that happens from that. Then we have Nitya pralaya, right? Which is basically your daily decay of beings, right? Then you have Prakrita pralaya, which is basically when you have the natural dissolution after 1,000 Chaturyugs, right? If 1,000 Chaturyug have passed, then you have Prakrita pralaya, right? And then you have Atyantika pralaya, which is basically your final dissolution into Brahman, right, into the final reality, so to say, right? So this idea of complete cessation, right, this idea of dissolution, right, and the movement towards that, right, talks about increasing levels of complexities, right, and how it kind of finally subsumes into this fundamental, physicists often talk about heat death, right, about how everything kind of ceases to be, and there is nothing more in terms of the increase of entropy, so to say, which will happen, and then that just leads to the final cessation of existence itself, right? Now, when we talk about classical Indian texts, right?
In both these analogies, in the stories, so there is a conservation of energy. There is a essence of conservation of energy, and also the controlled chaos.
Right. I mean, well, conservation of energy is not explicitly mentioned, but metaphorically or poetically, right, there is an element of how it is kind of distributed, how it is conserved in its own way, and how the dissipation aspect of it is covered, basically, right? So in the Indian texts, right, we have this concept of rhythm, right, which we had discussed last time as well. And when we talk about rhythm, one thing that comes to mind, which we have to address when we're talking about entropy, entropy can be discussed in terms of disorder, right? But it also can be discussed in terms of randomness, right? Or in terms of the distribution of microstates, as it is called, right? In the thermodynamics perspective, right? So when we have randomness inherently requires some element of unpredictability, right? Unpredictability. And in that, when we look at the Indian knowledge systems, we have this element of Daiva, right, which is the divine will, right? So there is Daiva, and Daiva it is not predictable. It is often even opaque to those who are not seekers or who don't believe in it, basically. and that leads to a lot of confusion as to why we are doing things in the way we are, right? There is a question often that if the final aim is to kind of move towards Brahman consciousness, right, and there isn't an overarching meaning of life as we know it, right, why do we do what we do, right? So Sri Krishna beautifully tells us in the Srimad Bhagavad Gita that we have to act without an attachment to the results, right? That is because, I mean, as we say in English, man proposes and God disposes, right? So there are times when we think that we have a certain control of sorts, right? And we have a certain decentralized agency, right? But that is not always the case, right? That is something which is superseded by, in the Astika traditions, right? We talk about Daiva, which is the divine will, so to say, right? So that is a very interesting way in which randomness at our level, right, is superseded by it's almost like a hidden variable theory. In quantum mechanics, we used to talk about that, where there is a deterministic way of thinking, right? There is an ordered way of thinking, but there are some variables, right, which we do not have control over. We do not even have access to, right? That is why we see that as not ordered, sorry. Right. That has an element of chance, therefore, right? So this unpredictability aspect is very important, right?
That's the very nature of life also,
right? Absolutely.
Like the micro changes, the entropy,
absolutely,
within the universe, a closed system within the universe,
absolutely.
And that's why this energy we are getting from sun,
right. And in fact, every element of movement or evolution, right, and even in the quantum mechanics, there is this element of measurement. If every such act or event has a non-trivial effect on the system itself and things that are around it also, right, so to say. So now the other thing with randomness is this idea of irreducibility, right? You cannot reduce it to something which is constituent of it, essentially, beyond a point, because if it is inherently random, right, what do you reduce it to, right? You can maybe have some segments which are ordered, right, which have certain degree of a scheme or a certain structuring, let's say. But if it is completely random, right, it is difficult to do so, right? Now, the idea is that even in the Indian knowledge systems, when we talk about Brahman, right, when we talk about different elements of nature itself, there is this element of not being able to algorithmically, right, I would like to use this word, algorithmically compress it to a set of individual ideas or elements, conceptual elements, right? Because in the case of Brahman, we can't even articulate it, is the point which is often raised, right? Aparushya and Anirvachaniya, right? Which is basically you cannot talk about it or you cannot articulate Satchidananda, right? So this is very important, and the idea that randomness also has a certain invariance and a certain objectivity, right? If you were to have randomness from different aspects, there is a certain element of invariance across these perspectives. Similarly, the Satya, right, the truth of the universe, has a certain element of, what do you call this, invariance for everybody who's out there, right? Or anybody who sees it, right, who approaches it. And we always say that there are different ways to approach it, right? You will still reach that invariant truth, so to say. Now, the question then is, am I saying that that truth itself is random? Right? That is a question that should come to mind, right? Well, in the case of Vedanta, right, there is Brahma Sutras, when they talk about this element of Swabhavavada. Swabhavavada means the doctrine of self-becoming. Our own tendencies making us what we are or what we will be, right? Now, that is something they go against, right? They say that it is not something which is important beyond a point, because there isn't an importance or primacy of Swabhavavad. There is something more than that. There is a greater order of things which makes things happen in the way they do, right? So inherently what it is saying is that there is a certain order, right? There is a certain, again going back to the rhythm, the idea of rhythm, right?
Like the karmic baggage from the previous life.
So there is an impression of randomness, right? But it has a certain inherent order, so to say, right? That is what the Brahma Sutras will be talking about. So even if we talk about Brownian motion or quantum fluctuations, what a Vedantin or somebody who is advocating or promoting this aspect of the Brahma Sutra will say is there is a Swabhavavada of sorts of that. But underlying that is a latent ordering of sorts, right? Which is the premise or the foundation over which that is established, right? So now there is also this element in quantum physics that comes in, which talks about indeterminacy or randomness. at two levels, right? One level is when you're talking about the epistemological randomness, right? The way in which you're presenting the data, for instance, or the way in which your procedure is being undertaken, right? And there is an element of whether there is objectivity or not, right? And there is an ontological randomness or ontological uncertainty or indeterminacy, which even if you were to have the best equipment, best measuring apparatus, even then you will have that randomness, so to say. Right. And in quantum mechanics, when we talk about the uncertainty principles, right, we discussed last time.
Observation.
Yeah. Right. So even if I were to give you the best apparatus out there, right, even then there is an inherent simultaneous uncertainty of sorts between these complementary variables, energy, time, position, momentum, so on and so forth. So that is an ontological uncertainty, right? Ontologically, it is, regardless of how well you do the experiment, right, it is still present, right? So this element of uncertainty, which is inherent, is something which we also see in our Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, where we talk about different elements. Once they have come out of the level of the fundamental reality, there are moments of fluctuation, so to say. Right. There are elements which are completely uncertain in their own ways, right? So that is very, very important.
So like also we have free will,
but
also we have the karmic baggage from the previous life. We can also kind of explain the varna.
Yes, but I mean, I wouldn't want to, discuss much on the varna aspect, because when we talk about the varna comes from the word color, right? And the color is basically when you have previous latent samskaras, and they try to discuss it with respect to that. I have my thoughts on that, and I think we can take it forward in a later discussion. But in this case, it is talking about this underlying kind of ordering of sorts, right? One very important kind of anecdote, right, or illustration is that of the Mahabharata, right? So in the Mahabharata, when you have this aspect of the Kurukshetra, right, and the battle of the Kurus, there is so many elements of randomness, so to say, right? In fact, the very premise, the very core crux of the Kurukshetra war was the game of dice. Right, the game of dice, and as we know, dice is inherently probabilistic, right? You have six faces.
We are going into the realm of statistics.
Yeah, statistical mechanics now, right? So, in fact, a few days back, I was discussing with some of my students, right? In fact, there is a story that Bhishma Pitama had attacked Gandhar, and that is why. And when he had captured the royal family, right, and they were confined to imprisonment, and they were given very low rations, right, food essentially. And they had conserved all of it and given it to Shakuni, right? And Shakuni was the only one who survived. And then he vowed that he will avenge his family. And then with the bones of his ancestors, with his family, he made those dice, right? But there is a very simple statistical explanation of that as well, right? If you have a weighted dice, if you have a biased dice, right? Or even a coin for that matter, there are ways you can make, bias it essentially, right? What that means is that some of the faces will have more probability of falling than the other faces, so to say, right? So it is beautiful to see that this element of statistics was very much present at the very core of one of our greatest itihasa, our greatest epics, right? And how that led to this series of randomness which came about, right? So when, for instance, Lakshagriha happened, right? Lakshagriha, even there, this element that they had known because Vidura came, right, and told them beforehand, and then they fled, right? Then, for instance, when they were in their exile, essentially, and then the 13th year happened, and then there was that conflict that happened, how they kind of went around that. Even during the Kurukshetra battle, the ways in which they countered the various different elements, there was so much of contextual thinking that had to be happening, right? And it was not something which was given from the get-go. In fact, when the Kurukshetra battle started, the Kauravas were much more powerful in many ways, right? In terms of their battle commanders, in terms of their absolute army, because even the Narayani Sena of Shri Krishna was with the Kaurav, right? So how do you so everything basically went around with an element of chance, so to say, right? An element of contextual development. But the beauty is that all of it was playing out in what we regard as Krishna consciousness.
Leads to a singular result.
A singularity of sorts.
What in between also matters.
Yes, but what matters, there is scope for fluctuations, right? But how that fluctuation translates, right, will be part of an overarching kind of order. right, in the part of the Krishna consciousness that we talk about. So that is one beautiful way to think about it. Even in the Ramayana, right, when Lanka was a beautiful city, it was Sone ki Lanka, call it, right? But the degradation had already started, essentially. And, the ways in which the stability of the system, the society itself, was kind of increasingly going down in certain ways in terms of moral degrading or degradation. And Hanumanji, when he kind of burnt the Soniki Lanka, you can think about it as energy finally kind of, giving rise to the complete destruction and dissipation of whatever is concentrated in that way, and leading to the final destruction, so to say, right? So this idea of entropy, randomness, order and disorder, right, and statistics, how it comes in, it's beautifully, intricately kind of wired into so many different areas, as I just mentioned, that it is wonderful to see that we never shied away from the fact that, if there is disorder, right, how do we work around with it, right? And the Astika people would say that we work with the will of God, right? And even that randomness, even the what you call the negative aspects of it, right? The destructive elements of it is actually working within a larger framework, right? Which is harmonizing, which is leading to some semblance of balance and equilibrium, right?
Conservation
of conservation of energy as well as equilibrium, and consciousness. But consciousness itself comes out in different expressions, right? So how you kind of reconcile that, right? Because within the larger framework is something very important.
So it's the Leela or the Maya.
The Leela, right? Because even like I think we were discussing last time and just before, that Duryodhana, right, went to heaven before Yudhishthira, right? Why is that? Right?
Of course.
I mean, he was the antagonist, right? Now the thing is, even Duryodhana, even Ravan, right? There is a backstory to that as well, by the way, right? We are all familiar with that. So they were part of this greater play.
Yes.
Right? This greater, almost like a puppet show, right? Where you have the threads are being pulled, right? And you just have to play out that role as such. And in doing that, you are actually playing out this bigger Leela, which is leading to the establishment of Dharma.
Yes.
Right? So that is the beautiful kind of way in which the randomness is part of this greater equilibration that is happening.
And if I say it's a closed system and whatever its outcome, it doesn't matter.
Right. And a closed system, however, it is part of a more kind of larger context. Right? It's a larger context which it is placed within, basically. Right? So that is very, very important. Basically.
Right. So now we come to the second the second law of thermodynamics, which is the inevitable increase of entropy. The second law of thermodynamics points an inevitable increase in entropy in an isolated system, leading to the arrow of time.
Right.
However, Indian philosophical traditions, particularly in Advaita Vedanta and Kashmir Shaivism, suggest that the time is an illusion.
Right.
Maya, that is the Maya, or subjective construct. How can this perspective challenges or contemplate the thermodynamic notion of time's unidirectionality?
Right. So when we are talking about time, and when you're talking about non-dual traditions like Advaita Vedanta, Trika Shaiva Darshan, we have to understand that they spoke about everything that we see in nature in terms, or rather the absolute truth, the fundamental truth of nature, being beyond space, time and causality. Right? So they said that space, time and causality are emergent. They are something which kind of are not there from the very beginning. They are emerging from the fundamental reality, so to say. And therefore, the fundamental reality is not contingent on space, time and causality beyond a point. So even in physics, when we talk about the laws of physics and the space and time aspect, it is seen and it is discussed. It's still a matter of debate, of course. That in the very beginning, when the Big Bang happened, if you go by the Big Bang theory, then space, time and causality arose from that, right? Arose from that aspect of that singularity bursting out and the energy that came out of it.
Now, before that, there is no time also. It's a
that is a conjecture, right? That's, again, we cannot prove it as such, I mean, empirically speaking, because then we'll have to have access to the realm that is beyond our universe. Right? We'll have to go.
And we can't even observe
We can't observe that. In fact, there is something known as the event horizon, right? Where beyond that, even the light from that region cannot reach us.
Right.
So
and the observable universe.
So we have a certain picture, but we do not know whether the universe extends, how much it extends, and if we are part of a multiverse, right? If there are multiple universes, and so on and so forth, right? Which we'll discuss shortly. Now, when we speak about that, there is this element of how we look at the Satya, the element of Satya, right? So when we say Paramarthika Satya and Vyavaharika Satya, so the Paramarthika Satya is the fundamental reality, the fundamental truth, essentially. So if the fundamental truth is itself beyond space and time is a construct for it, right? It is something which is projected out because of Maya, let's say in Vedanta, and in other cases there is element of Prakriti, or even in Trika Shaiva Darshan, there are aspects of the illusory aspect of time, right? It's not fundamentally part of Paramashiva beyond point. It's something that arises out of it, right? So it's not bounded, it's not constrained by time necessarily, right? Now, in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, we have had this element of the yugas, right? The Satya Yuga, Dwapar, Treta, and Kali Yuga, essentially. Now, we have already discussed about Pralaya, right, and Srishti, and there is this aspect of how degradation happens. So when we talk about degradation, that is happening in multiple levels. So if a physicist were to be asked, we will say that it's physically also in a way happening, because we know that by the second law of thermodynamics, there is a gradual increase of entropy overall, right? And it is never going back. It is never kind of decreasing per se. So there's a directionality element of sorts. However, having said that, there are times when locally entropy can decrease. Right?
That's one thing that student of physics got confused about.
Right. So locally there is a possibility of decrease of entropy, and even in our Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, I like to think of this one story, which is the story of Hiranyakashipu, right? And when Prahlad, right, Bhakt Prahlad. There was so much darkness in the world, right?
We just celebrated Holi.
Holika Dahan, right? Holika Dahan comes from that story. So there was so much of degradation and darkness, and in that there was an element which was not going by that line of thought. It was not dark, it was pure. It had an element of trying to reinstate order, right? Just a child, Prahlad, Bhakt Prahlad, right? And to his call, right, Sri Hari Vishnu came as Narsimha-ji, right? So that is something where I see that there is a localized reduction of entropy in a greater increase in entropy in that sense, right? A greater degradation is happening, but there is a more localized kind of correction of sorts, right? A decrease of entropy, so to say.
We can draw the parallel, like without darkness, how can you understand the goodness?
Right, and the contrast, basically. Yes, but the thing is, the question that comes to mind is in Kali Yuga, especially when we say that there is so much of darkness, right? There's so much of, vices of people and, degradation of every kind. Is there a possibility of something which is more redeeming, right? Now, the answer to that would be that if I were to be going by purely statistical mechanics and entropy, locally, yes, right? Locally, yes. And until and unless it reaches that final point, right, which we often talk about in heat death and many other theories, I think there is a natural way in which it will lead to its death, almost its cessation, right, of the entire creation, and then the renewal will happen, right? Then the renewal, which is Pralaya.
Journey is important. And how can you explore life?
Exactly.
Life will be non-existent without the change of entropy.
Right, and so the Pralaya will happen after that, right? So in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, this idea of Kala, right, the measure of time, for instance, in the Atharva Ved, right, in Khanda 19, Sukta 53, it is Kal is spoken of in terms of a horse, right? It's spoken of in a horse that carries 7 rays, right? It is 1,000-eyed, right? It has an ageless nature to it. It has an ageless, which is very funny because age itself is defined in terms of time, right? So there is a what you call a self-referential kind of definition, right? Which is talking about the characteristic in terms of itself, basically, right? And the wise continually seek to find it, this horse, this time, this kala, right? And its wheels. So this horse is pulling a chariot. You can think of it as a chariot. The wheels of the chariot are the entire cosmos.
Oh, wow.
Right? The wheels are the entire cosmos containing all the worlds that we have out there, right? So in the Atharva Veda, it's beautifully mentioned, right? In the Srimad Bhagavad Gita, right, we know that Shri Krishna said that I am time, the devourer of the worlds, right? The devourer of the worlds.
It's
right?
like the exponentially expanding universe.
Right. And so in that, if you say, why should time be the devourer of worlds? Is a question one should be asking, right? Why is it that time or Kala is looked at as a devourer of worlds, right? In that, I think we need to understand, even from the physics perspective, how do you define time, right? The definition of time, if we are talking about the unidirectionality, right? The arrow of time, right? And if you're talking about it from the statistical mechanics perspective, we are talking about in terms of entropy again, and in terms of certain ways processes happen. So definitely time is contingent on that process happening in the way it is happening, right? So therefore, why time passage, the passage of time itself, it is naturally leading to the degradation. Because if entropy has to increase over time, then the disorder does increase, and it will lead to greater degree of randomness, disorder, or more micro states, if I were to put it very technically, which will invariably lead to the devouring element which Sri Krishna talks about,
irreversible.
Right? Which is irreversible. There's no reversibility aspect to that. So the change and the transformation aspect is beautifully brought forth in the in Srimad Bhagavad Gita in this element which Sri Krishna talks about. Right now, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, right, and here I would like to briefly mention that our understanding of time in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara was actually quite qualified and advanced in its own way. Right now, there are a lot of debates about how we equate it to our modern time keeping, essentially, or the units of time. So, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, for instance, the smallest element of creation is called the Paramanu, right, which we have already spoken about. And the smallest measurement of time is the duration of a reaction that results in the combination of two atoms. Okay, so 2 Paramanu give rise to an Anu. Right, the double atom, so to say. 3 Anu give rise to a Trasharenu, right, which is a hexaatom, not triatom, because 2 Paramanus are themselves 2 atoms, right, and 3 of these basically gives a hexaatom, right. Now, the time required for 3 Trasharanu to form a complex of 18 molecules, right. So there is hexaatom. If I take 2 other hexaatoms, if I combine them, right, there is something known as the Trasharenu Trikam. Right? So that time which is required for that thing to happen is called a Truti, right? So which is approximately said to be 1/2 of a thousandth of a second, right? So that is the basic time, you can call it the first step, so to say, right, which we go from, essentially, right? So 100 Trutis make a Veda, 3 Vedas make a Lava, 3 Lavas make a Nimesha, 3 Nimeshas make a Shan, we talk about Shan. Right? 5 Shans make a Kashta, 15 Kashtas make a Laghu, 15 Laghus make a Danda, and 2 Dandas make a Muhurta. Right? When we talk about Muhurta, Shubh Muhurt, nikal ja raha hai, right? We say that, right? And in modern terms, if we think about it, Truti can be thought of as 0.000592 seconds. Okay?
I mean, it's amazing why they need this.
Right. Can you imagine? It's almost in micro, right? It's in micro, 10 to the power minus 6, right? Seconds. And so then you have the Veda, which is 0.0592 seconds. Lava would be 0.177 seconds. Nimesha, 0.533 seconds. And so on and so forth. Muhurta comes to 1 hour, roughly, right? But we don't stop there. We go even further. Right? We say 3 muhurtas make a prahara, right? 8 praharas form an ahani, which is a 24-hour circle. 15 ahanis make a paksha. Paksha is fortnight, right? 2 pakshas make a mas, which is a month, right? Which corresponds to 1 full day and 1 night in the Pitralok. When we talk about Pitralok, that's a different realm which we speak about, where our Pitra, right, our ancestors happen to be, right? 6 masas form a ayanam, right, which is a basically half a year. 2 ayanas form a year, basically, which is called a Vatsara, right? It's a 1 lunar year, equivalent to 1 full day and 1 night for the demigods. We speak about the demigods.
So not only we can provide Indic terms for light years, maybe more than light years,
potentially.
Also the lifetime of a lepton.
Right. I mean, different realms of reality, right? I mean, demigods, we cannot say that they are some specific subatomic particle necessarily, or, some physical entity. But what we are saying is it's frame dependent. it's realm dependent, right? When we say Pitralok, one day, one night is with 1 month here, means there is a certain contextuality there, essentially, right? So that's a very important, interesting aspect, right? So then we talk about Bhumandal, right? The intermediate planetary system, so to say. And then 1 year for the demigods corresponds to 360 days, right? 360 years in the Bhumandala, right? And the duration of the 3 yugas also, we have often heard about that. There is still debate about whether it translates to a specific number of years in our present context or not, but the aspect of 4.32 million years, right, in the Bhumandala, that is spoken of as a Divya Yug, right, the full cycle of the 4 yugas, right, and a Manvantara consists of 71 Divya Yug, right, totaling about 8,52,000 celestial years, so to say, right, and then the end of the Manvantara marks a cosmic event, right, which is kind of like the conclusion, more profound than the conclusion of the Kali Yuga, and impacting the entire cosmos, right. Then a kalpa, a day of Brahmaji, right, lasts for about 4.32 billion years, right, and that 2 kalpas together, span 8.64, and 50 years of Brahma, which is known as Parardha, right, amounts to 155.52 trillion years, right. That's a massive time. 2 parardhas make up a Mahakalpa, which is basically 311.04 trillion years, and the entire lifetime of Brahmaji equates to 1 Nimesha or blink of Lord Mahavishnu, right? So highlighting the vastness of time which we're talking about, right? So from the very small 1/2 of a thousandth of a second, right, we are going to roughly about 311.04 trillion years, right? That is the entire spectrum of time we are talking about, right? So and we are not even discussing here about the cyclicity aspect, which we had discussed previously. There is a cyclic aspect to things, and we will discuss going forward, but the sheer enormity and the nuance of the time aspect is so wonderful to look at again, right, within our Bharatiya Gyan Parampara.
And with your permission, sir, I like to say that demigod you mentioned, it's like the Devtas, right?
Right.
So they have a yoni.
Right.
So they are not completely mortals like us.
Right.
But they are in a broader level, they are mortals. So they will.
I would say not just mortals. I would say even elements, right, and the realms of existence. There are many different realms at which things exist, right? Even in the physics world, right, there are different epochs, number one. Then there are different layers in which they stay in or they reside, and the behaviors and so on and so forth. There are different pockets of the universe where you see very interesting things happening, right? So the aspect of time, right, and the time is not absolute, right, which is what we speak about in Einsteinian relativity and so on and so forth. We say time dilation and length contraction. So the idea that time is not absolute, it is frame dependent, it is contextual, right, is something that we see here. Right? Yeah. We say that the entire lifetime of Brahmaji is in 1 blink of Mahavishnu. What do we even mean by that? Right? So it's such a beautifully put metaphorical kind of poetic way of saying that the time is all relative. Right? It's dependent on the observer, on the frame, on the context, basically.
Like you talked about microsystems, sir, and now we will have to look at the interaction of heat within the microsystems. Right. So my next question will be, what role does that heat play in modern physics and in the within the lens of IKS?
Right. So heat is a very, very important part of thermodynamics. When we talk about the first law of thermodynamics, second law, and so on and so forth, and it has an intricate connection with respect to irreversibility. Right? When we talk about this arising from certain kinds of fluctuations of particles, right? And there are certain statistical mechanical processes, basically, which lead to the heat generation, so to say. Now, the very important part is that it is a process-dependent form, right? It is something which leads to different kinds of processes have different heat characteristics, and we study about enthalpy, we study about different concepts which lead to different forms of heat, right? In chemical reactions, for instance, we have seen in many different contexts. Now, in contrast, while the heat aspect is looked at purely from a statistical aspect or a thermodynamic aspect in modern physics, heat and Agni, especially the element of Agni, is looked at from a more ontological perspective in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, right? And what do I mean by that, right? So Agni or heat, essentially, Agni is not heat, but Agni gives rise to heat, to the element of heat. Heat has been looked at from the aspect of biology, right? In Ayurveda, we talk about heat in certain ways. We look at heat and Agni in the context of orthopraxy, right? How the rituals, how various aspects of our traditions have been oriented. And heat, of course, is looked at from a metaphysical or a foundational aspect as well, right? So there are multiple different levels as such of heat, so to say, right? So it's very important to see how that comes to be, right? So in classical thermodynamics, we have, heat is understood with things like the Clausius inequality, for instance, which quantifies the entropy production, the production of entropy in irreversible processes, right? And statistical mechanics tries to link the heat flow to microscopic interactions, essentially, where temperature is basically looked at as an average kinetic energy of the particles as such, right? So the Boltzmann distribution we all often talk about is basically how the energy is distributed among different states, essentially. And fluctuation theorems, there are some fluctuation theorems in modern statistical mechanics. This takes it to the non-equilibrium side of things, right? What does that mean? Non-equilibrium, as the word suggests, is a system which is not quite in equilibrium, right? And there is an active exchange of energy, so to say, and heat dissipation is considered in that, essentially, right? So in Indian knowledge systems, when we talk about heat, in Nyaya Vaisheshika, for instance, we talk about tejas, right? This aspect of tejas, which is fire / heat, you can talk about it. And it's not just a emergent property of matter, okay? It is basically an inherent dravya. It is an inherent substance, right? It has its own gati, it has its own motion, and it has its own kind of constituent particles, right? It has its own kind of constitution, so to say, right? And so it is a fundamental category in itself, right? And a fundamental dravya in itself. Category would be the wrong word, because dravya itself is a category, so to say. The 6 padartha are actually dravya, guna, karma, samavaya, samanya, vishesha, right? Which is the 6 for Nyaya Vaisheshika. And within dravya, tejas is 1, essentially, right?
Tejas is important in the Tantra also.
Yeah, so I'm coming to that. So we will have this idea that the recognition of tejas as inherent to the sensory and the ontological domains as such, right? So now, when we talk about quantum thermodynamics, there are times when coherence or cohesion of a system remains even after classically it should not have, right? There are certain ways in which quantum heat engines, we talk about quantum heat engines, they perform more efficiently than many other classical analogs, so to say, right? And there is also this very beautiful concept called the Landauer principle, which connects the element of information to heat or to the thermodynamic side of things, okay? So it says that information erasure, if you erase information from a system, that leads to heat dissipation. Okay, it's a very interesting concept, right? So that is also, you can think about it in another way, the idea of entropy itself, right? When we spoke about it in the 19th century, let's say, or afterwards, in the initial parts, we spoke about it in terms of disorder, in terms of thermodynamic aspects of things. But now we have come further, right? When von Neumann entropy is talked about, or Shannon entropy is talked about, in quantum, in computer sciences as well, we speak about the microstates, the different kinds of states of the system, which lead to a definition of entropy in terms of the microstates themselves.
And also, right? Analogous to information.
Right? So, so if there are more number of microstates, that would inherently mean there is more information in the system, essentially, right? So you see, there is a connection of the heat, the thermodynamics, with the information side of things, right? Now, it's very interesting because in Advaita Vedanta, we speak about heat and energy, right, as something which is immanent. But underlying it is a more fundamental level of consciousness. Right? So now I think last time we discussed about a little bit on consciousness itself, and there are some theories which try to posit that integrated information is consciousness, right? So there is the Tononi's integrated information theory, which is a very promoted theory in the Western context. But I would say that that is not a theory that quite does justice to the idea of consciousness in the in Indian context, in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, because the integrated information theory is emergent. It is something that is coming from a underlying reality. It is building up on that. So there is information of a system. How do you integrate the information? That leads to consciousness is the hypothesis of this theory. Right? Whereas in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, consciousness is fundamental. Right? It is what is underlying everything that we see around us. Right? Now, defining it firstly, the Vedantin would say you cannot even define it, right? There's no, it's a pointless,
it only
futile
take forms like you explained in the previous gunas.
Right, and gunas, and that is also a qualified form, right? When you talk about the pure consciousness, there is no way to articulate it actually, right? So that is what the Vedantin would say. So if we say that the heat aspect going to information by the Landau principle, or vice versa, is a connection to Vedantin aspect of heat subsuming into consciousness, I don't think that translation is quite there, right? It's not logically, or if we are consistent with the traditions, it's not something we should be speaking about in that way. But it definitely shows that there's an underlying reality of this heat aspect, right? It could be information, it could be consciousness, right? Which is also being brought forth in modern physics as such, right? Now, the next element that I would like to highlight is this of the Ayurvedic aspect of heat. Right. So when we talk about Ayurveda, then there are this aspect of Jathar Agni, right, which is basically digestive fire. Right? The fire that we have, because we know that metabolic, processes, they lead to oxidation. They lead to various kinds of processes.
Prakriti, I think.
Yes, so you have different, the dosha is one aspect, but in the purely digestive system itself, there is a way in which energy is generated from the food that you have, right? So there you have a certain aspect of Agni, right? That is kind of leading to the food to become the energy aspect, so to say, right? And then you have things like Samagni, right, which is balanced heat, Tiksh Agni, which is very fierce kind of heat, right? And Mand Agni, which is more mellowed down heat, right? So in this, when we talk about this, they are talking about different kinds of forms of the energies and the even the stability conditions, as we call it in the modern context, where at various equilibrium points there are either you escalate it or you regress it, you kind of take it down, right? Depending on the body's self-regulation. Right. So an Ayurvedic practitioner would basically talk about these Agnis. Obviously they talk about prana and dosha primarily, but the aspect of Agni is also very, very important. The last part here, when we talk about Agni and heat, is that of orthopraxy or rituals. Right. You spoke about Tantra briefly right now. So when we talk about the ways in which our traditions have different kinds of rituals, right? Most importantly, Yajna. Right, this aspect of Yagna, right? So heat is not then merely a physical element, or a physical aspect of nature, but it is more fundamental. It is a fundamental principle of almost transformation, right? It is that which transforms, right? From the material to the spiritual, for instance, and so on and so forth, right? So when we say that, when we talk about Agni or heat in this respect, there is the Agni which is Agni as it is, right? There's also this element of tapas, tapasya, tapas, right? Tapas comes from the word tap, right? So tap is basically when it is kind of scorching, it is kind of heating up something, right? Tap. So tapas is basically the inner fire of self-discipline, you can say, or sadhana, right? And that is very, very important when you talk about the Hindu way of, going towards spiritual kind of, transformation and liberation, even for that matter, right? So in Yajna, I mean, let's first start with the Agni as it is. When we put the Ahuti, when we put the oblations into the Agni, the idea is that oblation is being transformed, right, into something which is being offered more directly into the spiritual realm. So it is a material thing transforming to something spiritual. So the mediator of that is basically Agni. Right? In the Rig Veda, that's why we start with the devotion to Agni. Right? The first shlok itself, the first kind of very starting of Rig Veda has to do with Agni, right, as such. In the Agni Hotra ritual, for instance, right, when we have specific times when we say that the fire has a transformative aspect on the universe. Right? It's a controlling, harmonizing aspect of the universe, and Agni Hotra is basically based on that, essentially, right? And then when Yoga and Rishi Munis, right, they used to have a lot of years of tapasya. Right? There are these stories when we hear that one of the rishis was very angry with somebody, right? And with his eyes, with his very gaze, right, he burned somebody to ashes. Right? So that is a very kind of direct way in which the inner tapas, the fire of tapasya, essentially, and sadhana, has been transformed into a more direct kind of application on something which is a negative element. Right? So there you see the metaphorical, the spiritual, and the more empirical way of looking at Agni, right? Which is a very beautiful.
And you talked about tapas.
Yeah.
Well, the story of Rishi Dadichi.
Right. In fact, when we talk about Maharishi Parashuram and Maharishi Vishwamitra, there were times when their tapas and their the fire, inner fire, was so much that the cosmos itself was, up in disarray almost, right? There was turmoil of sorts, right? And Parashuramji was obviously very well known for being extremely fierce when he had to be. In fact, he also had a small confrontation with Ramji as well, right? At one point, and so that's a very interesting way in which a Purna avatar and a Ansh avatar is kind of, they come together.
The Shiv Dhanu.
And the Shiv Dhanu, right? So that is a very interesting story in itself. And so this idea of tapas and how the inner fire kind of brings about all that it does. In fact, Sri Aurobindo, right, when he wrote the book The Secrets of the Ved, it's a very beautiful way in which he looks at Rig Ved itself and the other Vedic traditions, books as well, treatises as well. And in that he says that Agni itself is kind of, Agni and Yagna are basically the internal self-oblations or the oblation of the vices, right, the things that are not good in us, into the fire of consciousness, right, leading to, or rather the fire of will and consciousness, you can call it, right, the sadhana aspect of things, and that leads to an elevation of your consciousness, so to say, right, of your being, so to say, right. So the entire Vedic corpus, right, I mean Vedic aspects, traditions, they have been looked at from the element of the internal dimension, right, and in that the element of Agni again connects back to tapas, to the idea of reflection or tapasya and sadhana, and meditation, and how we go from dharan, dhyan, samadhi for that matter, and how that leads to the cutting of the samskaras, right? The whole idea in the Hindu parampara is to look at how do you get rid of the samskaras, which are your latent tendencies that have been seeded in the karmic side of things, right? And how do you get rid of that, and how you move forward from there towards moksha, mukti, right, liberation, so to say. So all these dimensions, right, from Ayurveda to Yagna, to the different aspects of how we look at tejas, right, as a foundational category, a foundational dravya, so to say, is again a very comprehensive way in which heat, Agni, and various elements of that, nuances of that, are presented.
Right. So, like heat, the understanding of heat and thermodynamics gave rise to the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
But still, when we say that, it maybe sounds childish if we say in a single sentence like Yagna kundas are like engines.
Right.
But when you explain it like that,
right,
there are some resonance.
They are. I mean, because see, at the end of the day, what we are doing is we are putting fuel into an engine, right? Into let's say a train engine, right? And then there is work that is kind of brought from there, and there is a movement, right? In the so. I mean, I don't want to, equate it in that way, but there is a resonance of sorts where we are. That's our belief, right? That's the way we conceive it, conceptualize it.
And everything is analogical,
right? Analogous, right? And resonant, essentially, where we are providing this this spiritual fuel, if you will, right? And very important there is one thing, that it's not like if we have an abundance of material with us, right? There is an element of sacrifice as well. Sacrifice in the sense, not sacrifice of anything per se, but sacrifice of your own endowments, of what you have with you, right? And you are giving that away, right? So you are basically, by doing that, you are kind of getting rid of some samskaras as well, right? Because you are being selfless. You are kind of lessening the importance of your selfhood, right? In the very worldly sense, right? So you give away that which you can, not because you have a plenty, right? But even if you have a little, whatever you give, right? That is for reducing ego, reducing the idea of selfhood, right? And giving an oblation, so that your consciousness also gets elevated.
You're getting something,
right? Yes, and if that is reflected in yourself, this yagya is reflected in yourself, it is giving rise to your elevation or your ascent, as it is called, right? So of your consciousness.
Like the heat loss,
right?
There is no 100% efficient engine,
right? so you have to be, that is very good analogy, because the heat loss. I mean, if your internal workings, right? I often discuss this at times.
That's the sacrifice,
right? and sacrifice with a good mind, right? With a good heart, essentially, right? Because there are a lot of people who will go and do yajna for the sake of doing yajna, right? Or they will do puja part, right? All the aspects. But till you are not translating that into your inner yajna, right? Into your inner transformation, I don't think it will lead to much, right? Just like in this heat engine aspect, if your internal, purza, right, your internal mechanisms, right, are not working in the way they should, you can give it a lot of fuel, right? But it'll basically end up dissipating heat rather than translating to much, right?
Maybe analogically, we can say that the sacrifice you are giving is like the information go to the higher dimension.
Right. In a way, you can think of it like that, right? Metaphorically, you can think of it like that. And so this idea of how it translates, right, has to be from a pure consciousness and mind, right? Otherwise, there is no point of doing this, right? Even a few days back, somebody was asking that in many of these large festivals that we do, right, there are people who come with this idea, and especially in today's age, unfortunately, with a very shallow understanding of why they are there, right? Because they come with this idea that, almost like validation of sorts, right? They want to kind of be in the larger, this hullabaloo of sorts, right? Where everyone wants to be part of it. But what is it leading to, right? How is it leading to the transformation, the self-transformation? I think that is very, very important, essentially.
Very nice. Thank you. So, the concept of closed system.
Right.
So my next question will be the concept of closed system. The concept of a closed system in physics assumes an isolated framework where energy exchange is restricted. So to say, when we talk about correlations, this become less likely to be realized.
Right.
So Indian non-dual tradition challenges that notion.
Right.
Of separation and isolation, particularly in the context of interconnectedness in nature.
Right.
So how do you assess this from an IKS and scientific perspective?
So when we talk about closed systems is quite kind of an idealization, right? We never quite have a closed system per se, right? I mean, because even if you talk about a quantum system for that matter, there is always a correlation, like an interaction with the environment, right? There's a one-to-one kind of connection that gets established over time. And this connection leads to a lot of non-trivial aspects of the system itself, right? Which comes about because of those correlations. So the whole idea of decoherence, which I think briefly discussed in the last discussion we had, is that you have this movement from the quantum state to the classical state because of the collapse, which is again happening because of the correlations of the system and the environment, so to say. Right. So in statistical mechanics, closed systems are often spoken of in terms of microcanonical ensembles, right? This idea of microcanonical ensembles, where there could be energy movements, but matter is not quite kind of, it's closed in that sense, right? And energy is strictly conserved as well. But so you have microcanonical, macrocanonical, and grand canonical ensembles, right? So microcanonical is when you have completely closed, right? When you have no energy and matter, both are restricted. Macrocanonical can have some aspects, but in the grand canonical, you don't quite place those restrictions beyond a point as such, right? So now, when we talk about condensed matter systems, when we talk about biological networks and so on, there are rarely any system which exists in isolation. Rarely, right? And correlations between the subsystems themselves lead to entropy production, right? And they lead to equilibration or non-equilibrium conditions, so to say. So the fluctuations, right, and the entropy exchanges, right, they are very important in the emergent order, right? When the system is itself emerging and it's self-organizing. This flux of entropy from one subsystem to the other is a very important aspect to kind of discuss in that sense, right? So, in quantum mechanics, we can never discuss a closed system per se. Now, when we talk about the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, especially the non-dual traditions, we have to be a little careful in how we are defining it, right? So when we are talking about there never being a closed system, we are talking about the spiritual aspect of things, right? We are talking about the fact that there is an underlying premise, right, which is inherently interconnected, right? And last time also we discussed that entanglement and interconnectedness in the Vedantic aspect is not quite the same, Because one is talking about spiritual non-separability, the other is talking about non-classical physical correlations, right? They are just connections of properties per se, right? So in this case, when you talk about the system and the environment, right? The subject and the object. In the Trika Shaiva Darshan talk, right? I mentioned about how the subject-object binary itself is redundant. It's not useful to talk about when we talk about it in terms of Paramashiva, right? The aspect of the final tattva, the absolute tattva of Paramashiva, from which other tattvas come to be. So in Trika Shaiva Darshan, you have 36 tattvas that come from there, and they are all qualified aspects of that final fundamental tattva, so to say, right? So we are all part of that final fundamental tattva. Now, there is a very beautiful analogy or a beautiful metaphor or a motif which is talked about when we speak of Indra's net. Right? So Indra's net is basically this net which is there, right? And each node of that net, right, kind of reflects all the other aspects of the net, right? All the other parts of the net, and they are intrinsically connected such that they have an impact on every other node, so to say, right? So they are a highly connected kind of a net, right? And this is a motif that we get from our Bharati Gyan Parampara itself, and it's a beautiful aspect of interconnectedness, so to say, right? Now, in Trika Shaiva Darshan, we have this element of what we call as Spanda. So in Spanda, when we're talking about the perturbations of consciousness in the Shiva consciousness, so to say, everything arises from that, essentially, right? So the idea of the closed system again becomes moot, right? Because if everything is, so for instance, there's a very famous paradox, Mary's paradox, which I discussed in the talk, in the Trika Shaiva Darshan talk, that if Mary is a lady, is a scientist, she's a scientist, she has never seen color, right? And then she encounters color, though she has had information about color, right? How do you reconcile that? What will happen, right? So in the Trika Shaiva Darshan aspect, you would probably say that there will be a spanda in a pre-existing set of experiences and understandings which she will be presented with. Right? So there is nothing which is beyond that superset of sorts, you can call it, of this Paramashiva aspect or the fundamental reality aspect. Right? So the idea of a closed system or isolation is not even possible in the conceptual realm. Right, where you have something completely new and isolated that is still a part of a greater kind of understanding or a superset, so to say.
It will tend to the equilibrium.
To the
non-equilibrium.
Equilibrium. I would say it is neither equilibrium nor non-equilibrium. Right? It is beyond all the binaries, so to say. Right. So now there are few stories which come to mind. One is the Samudra Manthan. Right? When we talk about Samudra Manthan, there are certain, you can think of it as external perturbations, right? And the perturbations give rise to certain kinds of products, right? Which is hala hala and the amrit, right? And they, interestingly, it's very interesting that they both come in pairs, right? Hala hala will always come with amrit, right? So if you want to get amrit, you also have the hala hala, right? Yes. So there is a correlated aspect, right? Almost correlated emergence, which is happening, right? And in phase transitions, right? When you have emergent properties coming from correlated aspects, right? You can see something like this here as well, in a very kind of metaphorical way, so to say, right? Where there is a external perturbation and how the correlated aspect gives rise to something non-trivial, right? So which is basically the hala hala and the
matter and antimatter.
In a way, you could say that, or when entangled particles emerge, for instance, right? Now, when you talk about hala hala itself, you see that Shivji comes and kind of consumes the hala hala, right? And he tries to remove it from this delocalized kind of framework towards something which is more kind of controlled dissipation. I like to call it as controlled dissipation. There is still no isolation per se, but it is controlled way mein, it is dissipated across such that the entire universe does not get affected by it, essentially, right? So this idea of closure, right, this idea of containment, right, is also not there within the cosmological model, so to say, right? When we talk about entropy-driven kind of processes, we always talk about this aspect of heat death. Right? We were discussing previously in one of the interactions. And so in non-equilibrium systems, this idea of heat death is again connected back to the idea of pralaya, right? When you have complete cessation of all that you have out there, right? In terms of actions, movements, elements, energy itself,
absolute
and the entropy aspect of things as well, right? And so both of them kind of in a way are saying, both as in IKS as well as physics, is saying that isolationism, right? And absolutism in that aspect is something that is not possible, right? And we have to contextually define the system and its environment, any two systems interacting with each other, and underlying that, in one case, physics is still open to understanding what is the fundamental reality. I mean, there's no unified theory which everyone has accepted per se, but in the Indian knowledge systems, in Vedanta, for instance, you have an underlying degree of order, right? You have an underlying degree of consciousness, and that is what is giving rise to all that we see around us, right? So this idea of contextual self-organization, right, which is underlined by this premise of consciousness, is what the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara talks about. And within that greater framework, there is always chance for fluctuations, there is always chance of randomness, and there is always chance of statistical dynamics, so to say. So,
well, that's great, sir. Thank you very much. And I would like to say that it's like we are living the physical self itself. It's like a state of non-equilibrium, and it's tending to the equilibrium.
Right,
That's the physical depth of the body.
Absolutely.
And I think from the IKS perspective, our viewers will learn many informations from this talk, and also the student of physics also understand the intricacies of entropy, thermodynamics.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Here.
Thank you.